Hello from somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the Bahamas. In this video I'd like to go over the Truman and Eisenhower DBQs, both as a review of the time period as well as to help you again understand how to work these DBQ essays. Okay, so this video I recorded in 2016 somewhere in the Caribbean. I'm actually not on my cruise now recording this updated version for 2018, but I can't wait to have this view again. Again, the purpose of this video is to review the DBQ essay so that you better understand the topic and maybe what your essay should have done better, or maybe what your essay did, but what else you could have included. But it's also to help review the Truman and Eisenhower era, which is very, very important in understanding the Cold War. And so looking at this topic, we want to analyze developments from 1941 to 1949, so always pay attention to dates, that increased suspicion and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Then, to what extent, which means how much, was a prolonged Cold War inevitable? So here are some events. As I was looking at the prompt, I thought, okay, what events would go in this period, 1941 to 1949? Well, notice I kind of went before the time period, and I thought, well, gosh, we could maybe talk about some past history, like the Russian Revolution in 1917, the post-World War I Red Scare, or the fact that Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union in 1933, probably witnessing what was going on in the world, because 1933 was the same year that Hitler rose to power. And then also 1939, Hitler and Stalin shocked the world with a quasi-alliance in their non-aggression pact, and together they invaded Poland. Then in 1941, Hitler broke that deal, invaded the Soviet Union. 1941 was also the year that we finally entered the war. Now, we know Roosevelt and Churchill wanted our entry to be much sooner, but the American public was against it. But Pearl Harbor, of course, fixed all that. And we entered the war December 8th, 1941, a day after Pearl Harbor. But also because Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, now all of a sudden, that evil communist leader, Joseph Stalin, who prior we had looked at as being a harsh dictator and someone that we might have feared, now all of a sudden he was an ally. And so, and there were a few essays that mentioned this, which was great, that the American propaganda started to turn. In 1941 and 1942, you saw American magazines referring to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe because now he was an ally. Now this was a alliance of convenience because the Soviets needed us. We also needed them to continue waging that Eastern Front, so we might have a chance later for a Western Front. But notice we didn't open that Western Front right away. Remember, during World War II, the Allies invaded North Africa rather than Europe, which really ticked off Stalin. And then finally the big three meet. Now, Roosevelt and Churchill had already been communicating for a while. They've already met 3 times, technically, prior to the Tehran Conference in 1943, which also caused friction with Stalin. Because Stalin is saying, at least publicly, hey, I'm an ally too, it's time to be included. Stalin wanted certain things. He wanted a Western Front because Stalin's argument was he was fighting the war all by himself in Europe while we were gallivanting North Africa and then moving into Sicily. And so at the Tehran Conference, the agreement is finally made to open a second front in Europe. Now, of course, it takes 6 months, which again causes friction. Well, the D-Day invasion finally opens up June 6, 1944, and we know how that helped to unravel Hitlerism and Hitler's control of Europe, and eventually led to the end of the war. But towards the end of the war, in February 1945, this is before the Allies reached Berlin, just weeks before, the big three met again at Yalta. And remember we said Yalta has really big significance for the Cold War, because at Yalta, the post-war divisions of Europe were agreed upon. They agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation. They agreed to divide Berlin itself, which would have been within East Germany, the Soviet zone, but Berlin was divided. And you may recall me saying this earlier, that Berlin becomes the symbol of the Cold War, because those divisions, which were supposed to be temporary, remained. And we know later in the 1960s, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. And when the Berlin Wall came crashing down in 1989, and I remember this event as a kid, we all knew the Cold War was ending with it. So Berlin is very important. Berlin would be great to include in this essay. Well, then, of course, the war came. The Soviets were allowed to enter Berlin first, which also created some friction, but that was kind of a way of the Allies giving in to Stalin and the Soviets, that they had fought the war longer and had been invaded twice by Russia. Also, at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, of course, Germany by this point is knocked out. FDR has died. Truman has replaced him. Churchill has been voted out of office, and there's a new British Prime Minister. But at the Potsdam Conference, the final arrangements are made for the UN. Now, the United Nations has been a work in progress since the Atlantic Conference. It was a dream of Roosevelt and Churchill. That is finally agreed upon. The Security Council, remember we talked about the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, that's finally agreed upon. But also in the summer of 1945, the atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war with Japan. Now, Churchill knew about the atomic bomb project. We never told Stalin. Another source of friction and tension. Why wouldn't we inform the Soviets? Hint, hint, we didn't trust them. However, we always suspected that they had spies in the Manhattan Project, and then in the 1990s we finally confirmed that. Well, remember at Yalta, Stalin also made those promises that all of the countries that he quote-unquote liberated from Hitler in Eastern Europe, that he would give them free elections. Roosevelt made him promise that he would give those people free elections and they'd get to choose their own form of government. Stalin never kept that promise. And the first country to choose communism, and I put emphasis on that word because there really wasn't a choice, was Poland. And Poland became the first to fall, and it became a symbol of what was to come, that one by one Eastern European countries would turn, or rather fall, to communism. This is what Churchill characterized in his 1947 speech as the Iron Curtain. Also remember 1947, as one by one these countries are falling to communism, that there were communist insurgent groups in some places of the world, threatening to overthrow governments there. And in one place was Greece and Turkey. And Truman went to Congress, asked Congress for money to help Greece and Turkey, and in that gave his famous Truman Doctrine speech, where he said it must be the policy of the United States to assist free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This followed, of course, with the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, as well as the big, again, a Berlin incident, where Stalin blockaded all water and land routes, to West Berlin, and Truman responded with an airlift to help the people of West Berlin, that he was stubbornly going to hold on to West Berlin as a symbol of democracy in a sea of tyranny and communism. Again, more and more frictions. So these events were kind of cascading, happening one right after the other, that by the end of the 1940s, people realized what a dangerous threat the Soviet Union was. Also in 1949 was the formation of NATO, and the Soviets finally tested their first atomic weapon. And I just thought of one item I didn't include on this list, but was the fear of communism at home. Truman's loyalty program, HUAC, was in the Hollywood 10, was in the 1940s, the late 1940s, when those investigations took place. So there was already a second Red Scare. So hopefully that served as a good review of the time period. Now let's look at the documents. So if we think about where we just went, I just gave you a long list of events. If you had discussed what I just discussed verbally in your essay, that would have been half the battle. In fact, if this was a long essay, that would have been a great way to respond to the essay question and earn a top score. But we also have to include specific information from the documents. So let's take a look at document 1. This is the United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. So this is a U.S. ambassador to a U.S. official, right? And it's 1943, so we know it's during the war, but it's prior to 1944, so D-Day hasn't happened yet. And notice what he's saying. The absence of a second front prepares the ground for a strong Soviet stand in the field of foreign policy, to the extent that people around the world believe that the Soviet Union carried the major burden of winning the war. Would we want that? Think about that for a minute. Would we want the Soviets to carry the claim that they actually won the war? That's what he's saying. And the answer, obviously, is no. We don't want them to have that claim, because if they have that claim, then they could claim more territory, they could spread communism. So even though we're allied to the Soviets and we're claiming to be their friends, maybe not so much. Maybe we still don't really trust them. So what this document, and I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but what this document is arguing for is, hey, Secretary of State Hull, you might want to tell the president, we better open a second front, and soon, and not wait for it. Okay, and so here you could use this as an example to talk about the D-Day invasion, to talk about the tensions with Stalin and why we needed a second front to make sure that we had some credit at ending the war so that we could help negotiate the post-war situation. Let's look at document 2. Joseph Stalin, this is February 6, 1945, so this is right about the time of Yalta. And he says, Prime Minister Churchill has said that for Great Britain, the question of Poland is a question of honor. For Russia, it is not only a question of honor, but of security. During the last 30 years, our German enemy has passed through this corridor twice. So you could use this document to talk about the agreements of the post-war situation at Yalta and why we were a little bit wary of that and why we made Stalin promised free elections. You could also use this document to predict what happens eventually to Poland, that in 1946, Poland turns communist. So now it's your turn. Read this document and stop the video, and you'll be prompted to answer a question. Okay, so hopefully you got the right answer, that this is containment policy. So in the interest of time, I'm just now going to briefly talk about the remaining documents. Document 4 here is from Molotov, a Soviet foreign minister, and he's criticizing the West, Britain and the United States, claiming that we were not faithful to the promises of Yalta and Potsdam, which you could use some content from this document to talk about that friction between the post-war powers. This document gives us evidence of the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia, which you could also use to compare to other Eastern European countries, because this is the way that communism took over those countries as well. And here's another document that helps to illustrate the spread of communism in Europe. And in this document, you would pay close attention to the countries that are named here and the control that Stalin, and this is most likely Molotov, is exhibiting over these Eastern European nations. Remember, we called these satellite nations. These satellite nations were countries that had their own form of government, but we know they were being controlled by an outside force, that outside force being the Soviet Union. And for document 7, we're given data, and so I'm going to ask you a few questions about the data. And so here's the prompt that CMOD had. What were the Cold War fears of the American people in the aftermath of the Second World War, and evaluate the effectiveness of the Eisenhower administration in addressing these fears? So if we break apart this prompt, first we have to determine what are the Cold War fears of the American people in the aftermath of the Second World War. So not necessarily isolated to the Eisenhower years, but just in general, what are the fears? But then also we have to evaluate the effectiveness of the Eisenhower administration in addressing these fears. So we can't just simply describe what Eisenhower did, but we also have to give some type of judgment of how Eisenhower responded to those problems and those fears. And so, as I did before, I made a list. Here are the various Cold War fears: another world war, threat of nuclear war, possible invasion of the United States, though that wasn't likely, but some people feared it, invasion of U.S. allies, maybe in Europe, the spread of communism at home, the spread of communism abroad, maybe the domino theory that if one nation in a region fell to communism, the others would fall as well. Some still feared economic collapse and a possible return of a depression. Even in the 1950s, even though prosperity was going high, people weren't sure how long it would last. Remember, the depression was not that long ago. And then I also listed the events of the Eisenhower era. So take a moment, pause the video, and just look at these events. So as I did with the previous DBQ, I'll go through the documents, although I'm going to do this somewhat faster, frankly just to respect the time that you've given to watch this. But this first document actually is very, very important. And the reason is this document here, this press conference of Dwight Eisenhower, illustrates the various fears. So this gives you a lot of hints as to those Cold War fears to include. Obviously, we fear the men in the Kremlin. This is the Soviet Union. We fear what's going to happen in Europe, right? Our friends around them in Eastern Europe. For example, Berlin, in Hungary in 1956. We are fearing what unwise investigators. Here he's referring to McCarthy. Also, we get this fear of economic concerns. Remember, I mentioned in the previous slide about a return of the Depression, possibly. And also, Eisenhower kind of makes a point here is, are we overreacting to these fears? So that could be part of your analysis in your essay. But again, needs to be tied to specific historical events. For document 2, we have Dulles, the Secretary of State, who is warning about the spread of communism in Latin America. And we know that's going to be key, and we're going to see that grow throughout the Cold War in the 60s, notably with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll see it again in the 80s as well with El Salvador and what Reagan called the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And so we'll look further at that in the future. Okay, this document is discussing Public Law 627, which creates the interstate highway system. Now, this addresses two fears. One is the economic fears, because we know the effects of the interstate highway system, creating all of these new opportunities and jobs and commerce, but also interstates serve as a defensive measure. In case of war or invasion, we could move around military supplies and troops very quickly. Document 4 raises the question of our defense capabilities in a nuclear age. Here you could link Strategic Air Command, which we know was something the Eisenhower administration worked on building. You could also address with this document Eisenhower's drastic increases in military spending in the 1950s and use that as outside evidence. Now for this document, I'm going to have you pause and answer another question or two. Now going back to the documents, document 6 gives you useful data that you can use to support your argument. Notice here on line 1, we have evidence of the baby boom and that the economy is growing. Government spending is rapidly increasing, and this does alarm some conservatives in the 1950s. And the result is, look at this, we have a budget deficit, a pretty large one by 1959. Also, pay attention to the growth of defense spending. That would be a response of the Eisenhower administration to Cold War fears. And that's how you would use that document in your analysis as you are presenting a persuasive, compelling, sophisticated response to the essay prompt. And then finally we come to document 7 from Kennedy. So Kennedy takes a different tone than the Eisenhower presidency. You could use this document to discuss the results of the Eisenhower years. You could also use this document to be a springboard to later time periods, maybe discussing how Cold War fears remained during the Kennedy years, reaching their climax with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then maybe even predict how Cold War fears would eventually soften by the end of the 60s, at least directly with the Soviet Union, and then into the 70s with détente if you wanted to stretch it that far. Which, by the way, if you do stretch it that far, that connection, if you explain that connection, that would help achieve synthesis. Okay, so to wrap this up, I hope that this video has demonstrated some key things about a DBQ. First of all, the most important piece about a DBQ is to answer the prompt. Too often we are seeing DBQ essays that simply just walk through the documents and talk about the documents and explain the documents, which clearly is what I've done in this video. But again, the documents are supporting actors. They're just used as evidence to support the overall thesis. So you absolutely must answer the prompt, make a thesis about the prompt, and then organize your essay. Let's say it was the first one on Cold War fears and the Truman age. You need to structure your essay about the time period, 1941, from World War II to Truman, and then weave in those documents, where they support the argument. For the Eisenhower one, we needed a essay that discussed Cold War fears, and then the things that the Eisenhower administration did. So we'll put here Eisenhower's responses. And then again, using specific examples. So using, for example, the document about the National Defense and Education Act, but discussing that in the context of Sputnik, and maybe also mentioning NASA as other outside information. Again, structuring it just like you would a long essay, but using content from the documents to support the argument as well as outside information. And not, I'm going to say it again, not just summarizing documents. That's the key for the DBQ. Documents are helpful evidence. They're not the stars of the show. The history is. Well, that's enough for now. Thank you for listening.